Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Sei Lob und dem höchsten Gut, which translates to let there be praise and honor for the highest good. This is a pretty straightforward chorale. There's some interesting stuff going on in the beginning in terms of the impact that it has on the sound of the the tonality that's going on, but all in all, it's a pretty straightforward chorale to analyze. Let's just hop right in. So we have one sharp in the key signature. We start on G major, we end on G major. I reckon we're in the key of G major, and we have a passing tone in the tenor before we get B, D, G, and D. That's G major in first inversion with a passing tone in the bass. A little bit of imitation between the tenor and the bass there. We then have D sharp, A, G, and D. This G is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, which is basically just a D major chord because this F sharp fully fills out the rest of the chord. And that resolves where we would expect G major, G, B, G, and D, which is our tonic triad, and where I think we modulate to the key of C major. This G major chord is actually our 5 chord. This F kind of hits us and it sounds a little Mixolydian-ish based on the tonality of the melody, but I do think we're just getting a modulation here, and it kind of hits us by surprise because we would expect this to resolve to C, but instead it goes to F major, A, C, and F, which is F major over A. And we get some passing tones in the bass and the alto as well, which spells out a B, D, A, and F chord, which is B minor 7 flat 5 in root position, which is like a passing 7 chord, and 4 we would expect to go to 7. We then have C, G, E, and E, which is a root position C major triad. We have a passing tone in the alto. The C is a chord tone that turns into a suspension in this chord here, G, C, G, and D. It's actually this B here. The C is a 4-3 suspension, but this G major chord is no longer our tonic, it is our dominant. And our perfect authentic cadence concludes with our tonic C major, C, E, G, and C. Alright, looking ahead, we have a phrase that ends in the key of D major, however we go there via G major, and I think this C major chord is actually an eliding chord. It functions as the tonic of C as well as the subdominant of G, because we're immediately getting this augmented fourth leap in the bass, C to F sharp, D, A, and D, which is D major in first inversion, and that resolves to G major, which is now our tonic again, G, D, G, and B. We have a passing tone in the tenor and the melody as well before we get another G major chord. We don't need to analyze that, but then we get a series of passing tones, 2 in the lower voices and 1 in the melody, which spells D major in first inversion, which would be a 5-6 in the key of G major. Then we have E, G, G, and B, which is E minor, and in the key of G major that is a 6 chord, but in the key of D major it is our 2 chord, and we get some passing tones in the alto and the bass as well before we go to G, A, E, and C sharp. And I'm going to analyze this as a 5-4-2 chord because the 7th of the chord does end up resolving downwards if we look at this A as like an embellishing tone. But you could just analyze this as a 5 chord and this G being an accented non-chord tone, but I think it's more or less the same thing. But regardless, we go to D major in first inversion, which is where we would expect a 5-4-2 chord to go, F sharp, A, and D. That chord then gets turned into root position on the and of that beat before we get A, D, E, and E, similar to the cadence that we had here at the end of our first phrase. This D is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, and then when the C sharp gets introduced, we have G here, which turns the chord from a 5 chord to a 5-7 chord, so that's how I'm going to choose to analyze it. Maybe I'll put the 7 in parentheses, depending on how you look at it, but I look at it as a 5-7 chord. And then we have D, D, F sharp, and D, an incomplete tonic triad, but a tonic triad nonetheless. Okay, we kind of get faked out in this case. It kind of looks like we're going to the key of G here, because we have 5 going to 1 or 1 going to 4, depending on how you look at it, but we don't really stay in the key of G for more than 2 beats, so I think we're still in the key of D through our next perfect authentic cadence, which is also in the key of D. So I'm just going to keep analyzing in D major. So this G major chord, G, D, G, and D, which actually has no third, it's just an open fifth, is our 4 chord, passing tone in the bass before we get B, D, B, and G, which is a 4 chord. It's G major in first inversion. Then we have some passing tones in the lower voices. Typically when we get 4-6 going to 1, D, F sharp, A, and F sharp, we usually get this leading tone connecting the 6 in the bass and the tonic in the bass as well. And sometimes we get a fully voiced 7 chord like we do in this case, C, sharp, E, G, and B, which is C sharp minor 7 flat 5 in root position. So 4, 7, 1 happening here. Then we have some passing tones in the inner voices before we get A, C sharp, and E, which is A major in root position. That's our 5 chord, passing 7th in the tenor before we get an A sharp, some chromaticism in the bass. A sharp, F sharp, C sharp, and F sharp with a passing 7th in the tenor. That's F sharp major over A sharp, which would be the secondary dominant, or it'd be a dominant of 6, so 5, 6 of 6, because F sharp is the 5 of B, which is our submediant. And that goes exactly where we would expect it to, or does it? If we look in the bass, we have B, D, and D, which looks like a pretty good start. It's like we have our 6 chord there, but instead we have a G in the melody that resolves down to F. And this is an interesting little progression we have here, or to F sharp rather, not F natural. So this is a roundabout way of saying a deceptive progression in the key of B minor, because we would expect F sharp to go to B minor, but we have F sharp going to G, which is the 6 in the key of B minor. But in the key of D major, it's 4, and the fact that we're going to G, which is the tonic as well, is also kind of harkening back to the fact that we're getting faked out. The deceptive progression fakes us out, and we've been faked out in the key of G a couple of times. We start off in G and then we go immediately to C. We start off on G and then we go to D. We have a 5-1 motion here in the bass in the key of G, but we're still in the key of D. And then we have a deceptive progression that ends with G. There's just a lot of G focus here. And this is a 4-6 chord that kind of gets turned into root position here, but the 7th gets introduced in the melody, so I'll just talk about it. We don't need to mention it. But yeah, a bit of a deceptive progression here. It's pretty cool. I remember we saw this progression in the first chorale we looked at on the channel. We then have A, C sharp, A, and E, which is A major in root position. That's our 5 chord, passing 7th in the alto. And then we have D, A, F sharp, and D, which is our tonic triad, D major in root position. And I think now we're moving to the key of G again. We're going to see a theme. Our phrase ends in a half cadence in the key of A minor, so we start in G and then end somewhere else. So this G, in the key of G, D major is our dominant, similar to how in the key of C, G major is our dominant. Sorry, wait. I had a point that I was going to make there, but I forgot. Hopefully it comes back to me. But yeah, we go to G briefly, and I think we modulate somewhere in and around this G sharp right here. But then we have 5 going to 1, G, B, G, and D, which is our tonic triad in root position, passing 7th in the bass, E, G, B, G, and G, which is E minor in root position. That's a 6 chord, passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the tenor before we get C, D, G, and D. I think it's the C that's an accented non-chord tone. It's really this B here that's our chord tone, which would be G major in first inversion. Apologies. That's a 1-6 chord before we move to C, 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 G, and E, which is our 4 chord in root position. And I think you could say you modulate as early as this beat right here, but with this passing tone in the bass, we end up getting another C major chord, kind of, sort of. We have E, G, G, and B, which looks like an E minor chord, but I think this B is an accented non-chord tone. So we could call this a 6 chord again, but I think it's more likely that this is actually a 4-6 chord, and we are now modulating to the key of A minor via the mediant in first inversion. coincidentally, if we look purely on the downbeat, we have E, B, G, and B, which is like a minor dominant, which I think is unlikely that we're modulating via the minor dominant, but ultimately, I think it's more likely that we're modulating via the median, because we have some adjacent harmony happening at the same time here, moving forward. So we have F sharp, D, A, and D. That's D major in first inversion. Not a secondary harmony, but a harmonization of the melodic minor scale, E, F sharp, G sharp, and A. I know we're used to seeing the sharp there, but it's written into the key signature. Then we have some non-chord tones going on in the lower three voices. We have G sharp, B, B, and D. That's a root position G sharp diminished triad, so 4 going to 7 again, like we've seen in the past, like we would expect it to go to, 4 going to 7, 4 going to 7, etc. And then we go to our tonic triad. I said adjacent harmony. I usually expect this to be a 5-6-5 chord, but sometimes we see 7. A, C, E, and C is our tonic triad, which is where we expect it to go. But then interestingly, we get this very brief D sharp here, which sort of tonicizes the 5 chord and makes it almost feel like we're modulating in the key, or we're cadencing in the key of E minor rather than A minor, but on a major tonic. But I think ultimately this D sharp is just so brief that we're really just cadencing on 5 in the key of A minor. Which would be a half cadence, and usually the hallmark of a half cadence in Bach's chorale writing, that is when we have the 5 of the chord in the melody. Not always, but a lot of the time, the vast majority of the time I've found. And as we close our chorale for today with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major, we get a direct modulation. We have E major going to G major. That's pretty direct. We have 2 major triads that are a minor third away from one another. That's pretty direct. But yeah, we have our tonic triad here, G, D, G, and B. Then we have F sharp, D, A, and A, which is D major in first inversion. That's a 5-6 chord. Passing tone in the melody before we have E, E, G, and C. That's C major in first inversion, which is a 4-6 chord. Then we have an anticipation and 2 passing tones going on in the lower voices, which gives us F sharp, D, A, and C, which is like a passing 5-6 chord. That's D7 over F sharp before we go to G major, G, D, B, and B, which is our tonic triad. So I think in every case we've had a 4-6 chord in this chorale. We've had a connection via the leading tone, and all of the chords have been fully voiced. When we've had 4-6 going to 1, there's always been a passing chord on the and of that beat with the 4-6 chord on it. This G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. C, C, E, and A. That's A minor over C, which is 2-6. That might be our first. No, we've had 1-2 chord before, but it's not cadential. It's a common chord. Even though we get sort of like a mid-progressional cadential progression here, like pre-dominant, dominant, tonic. They're not in the dominant's not in root position. Neither is this one though, but this one we're seeing in closer proximity to a cadence. This B is a passing tone. C sharp, A, E, and E is a secondary dominant. That's A major over C sharp, which would be 5-6 of 5, because A is the dominant of D, which is our 5, our dominant. And that goes where we would expect D, A, D, and F sharp. That's D major, which is our dominant. And then we cadence on G major, G, B, D, and G, which is our tonic triad and root position. And that is our analysis for today. Kind of breezed through this chorale today. It is pretty harmonically dense, but it's pretty streamlined, and really the only point of contention that there might be is where I chose to modulate to the key of A minor, but there's definitely some type of modulation happening in this zone right here. So whether you think it happens earlier, whether you think it happens as late as the D major chord, what matters is that you're hearing the modulation, that's all. But other than that, this little mixolydian thing that's going on in the melody here is pretty interesting to listen to, but on the page really it does just look like a deceptive progression that happens to occur over a modulation, so that achieves a very mixolydian sound. If he had cadenced in the key of G major, I think we would have had a reason to talk about it a bit longer, but here we're just talking about pretty straightforward common chord modulation. And other than that, we have a bunch of 4/6 via 4/6 to 1 with a passing dominant chord, which has strengthened the arguments that I've made in the past, or the analyses that I've been making in the past about that particular pattern that makes itself into, it makes its way rather into a ton of Bach's chorales. So it's good to see them being used in regularity and harped upon, used a lot in this particular chorale. So I think I'm going to stop my commentary there. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. If you're interested in following me along on this journey to analyze all of the chorale harmonizations, or maybe joining me in analyzing on your own and then comparing your analyses to mine, feel free to subscribe and hit the notification icon. I upload once a day. And if you'd like your daily dose of analysis, or more specifically your daily dose of Bach, feel free to subscribe. I'd love to have you on the channel. The channel's grown so much. It's super exciting. This was it started off as a little pet project for me to have my thoughts in some semblance of a portfolio for my website, but people have been enjoying the videos, and I am thrilled to have people watching them. So thank you so much for engaging if you have engaged with the videos, and if you haven't, thank you so much for watching the videos. It means a lot to me. Okay, excellent. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis. Thank you again so much for watching the video, and I hope you take care.